Odds, bobs, hammer, and tongs. This episode of Recipe Redemption has taken 4 years to record because I've filmed it thrice already, including cooking segments, and somehow managed to lose or delete the footage each time. If I were a more superstitious soul, I'd think this episode be cursed. Arr. At any rate, avast, ye landlubbers. This be Recipe Redemption, and I be Captain Mike Uyak. Today be International Talk Like a Pirate Day, so methinks it only appropriate we talk about pirate food. On this here channel, we talk about old food and questionable food, and pirate food can be both. I'm going to drop this accent now because I'm not good at it. It's hard to keep up, and research has indicated that pirates didn't actually talk like this. Not many. The banter that we typically associate with pirates is almost entirely the invention of Disney. And in particular, Robert Newton's portrayal of Long John Silver in Treasure Island. He based the accent on sailors that he knew in the southwest of England, in the West Country. And at the time, in the West Country, R was an affirmative, kind of like I. And it was used a lot, almost like the Canadian A. It just came out. So while many sailors did indeed come from the West Country and therefore talk like that, there were so many pirates who hailed from, well, everywhere else. It's unlikely that R and the general way that pirates, we think pirates talk, it's unlikely that that became common parlance across all piratedom. You just imagine, French, Portuguese, West African, Arabic, or Asian sailors talking like this. They just didn't, mind you. So there are nautical terms that were part of daily conversation by necessity. You're on a sailing ship, so a marlin spike is a marlin spike, not a wooden rope stabber thingy. Mizzen mast is a mizzen mast, etc., etc. That's just what it's called, so that wouldn't be unique to pirate talk. But the accent and the grammatical structure we associate with pirates would have been an actual rarity to hear on actual sailing ships. So, anyway, moving on. In any discussion of what pirates ate and drank while at sea, the thing we have to get out of the way right off of the bat is the role that alcohol played in daily life. You have to realize that life at sea was more often than not one of basic survival. Robert Louis Stevenson might have romanticized the lifestyle of hard partying reprobates, but in reality, it was hard work in which you were just as likely to starve to death as reap great riches and adventure. So it doesn't really get more basic than to start with a discussion about water. You need it to live, and when you consider every sailor on board your ship needs up to a gallon of fresh, clean water to drink every day for the months that you may be at sea, this is your first and probably greatest problem. Thousands of gallons of fresh water were laded on board at the beginning of a voyage in barrels that filled the holds. But within a few weeks, all that water started growing things because it was untreated well water that might not have been all that great to drink to begin with. Very quickly it becomes, well, virtually undrinkable, either because of all the nastiness growing in it or just by virtue of the taste. More because of the taste. Enter beer. Alcohol content is just high enough it prevents stuff from growing in it, provided you manage to keep it sealed up until consumed and relatively cool. And even though beer can get a bit skunky if it gets too warm or sits around for too long, it's still drinkable and oftentimes much preferable to the nasty water that they were carrying. However, beer still takes up a lot of room. Now we get to the point in history when sugarcane plantations began to spring up in the Caribbean, or Caribbean, depending on how pedantic you want to get, and some enterprising soul tried fermenting and distilling it. Rum was born. And captains and commodores of many stripes realized what a boon this was. Because it was distilled, rum packed a greater alcoholic punch. So you could bring a smaller volume of it on board and still get the same result, antiseptically speaking. Early experiments with this idea were not successful. Each sailor got a cup of straight rum per day as a ration to be added to their water in a 4-to-1 ratio to make the nasty water safe to drink and more palatable. But some, okay, many, sailors chose to hoard it for a few days and then get blitzed out of their minds, which wasn't good for order and discipline. Thus, grog, which is that 4-to-1 ratio, was declared by Edmund Vernon as a more rational way to serve a rum ration to British soldiers. Sailors, not soldiers. So a barrel, or a butt, had its top cut off, or thus scuttled. Thus the communal drinking vessel and later drinking fountain came to be known as a scuttlebutt on board ships. And eventually, since people tend to gather around the water cooler and gossip, gossip eventually became known as scuttlebutt. Grog was mixed in this barrel on deck so that all hands could witness it, verify that the 4-to-1 ratio was indeed observed, so they were getting their full rum ration. And every sailor would get a cup of grog before watch and a cup after, guaranteeing everyone got their fair and equal ration of the rum, sufficient water to drink, and no one went on watch hammered. It was said that on your birthday, you got a double ration. This is the largest thing I have that looks kind of like a flagon. Don't judge. So, yeah. Tastes like watered down rum. Don't know what we were expecting, but that's, yeah. Occasionally, things like sugar, additional sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, or lime were added to the grog, turning it into a beverage called bombo or bamboo. Also, if your captain was fancy, you might also have gin on board. And the invention of the gin gimlet quite possibly had a hand in saving the British Navy. You see, one of the other problems you had, besides simple starvation and dehydration, was malnutrition. And in particular, we're talking about scurvy, a condition brought about by a deficiency of vitamin C. They didn't know that at the time. They just knew sailors got it for some reason. And on long, protracted voyages, there was a chance most of your crew wouldn't make it home because of scurvy. It was noticed on one particular voyage that one ship out of an entire flotilla did not have scurvy. And the only difference they could discern was that the captain had loaded a whole ship ton, see what I did there, of citrus fruits on board before heading back to England. It took a while to convince the Admiralty that citrus was somehow involved, and a much longer time before someone isolated vitamin C and verified that it actually cured scurvy. But eventually, limes in various forms became not only the norm, but required by law to be brought aboard before every voyage. That's why British sailors eventually became known as limeys, because they brought limes aboard and consumed them on every voyage. Rose's lime cordial at the time did not come in plastic bottles, but Rose's lime cordial, or a sweetened lime juice, was invented by Lachlan Rose as the very first time someone had successfully concentrated a fruit juice. Again, concentrated stuff took up less space, and this lasts for way longer than fresh fruit, so this was an easy way to bring lime juice on board, and when mixed with gin, was a tasty way to stave off scurvy. Zesty. I think I put too much of the lime cordial in there. Ooh, that's very zesty. But the gin gimlet was consumed in mass quantities as both a tasty way to give the crew their ration of alcohol, as well as a way to ensure your crew remained as healthy as humanly possible aboard a sailing ship in the 19th century, assuming somebody didn't bring smallpox on board, or because you were pirates in the tropics, the whole crew didn't come down with malaria, or, get shot. There are other beverages consumed by pirates, such as rumfustian, which was a hot beverage consisting of beer or ale, sherry, gin, raw sugar, and egg yolks. This takes a bit more work to make, and I'm fairly certain this was reserved for special occasions rather than being consumed on a regular basis. And I'm not going to the trouble of making this today because, well, it's 9:30 in the morning, and although I've been known to throw back a drink or two, I'm not that dedicated of a day drinker. So let's turn to talk of food. Fresh food went bad very quickly. I'm going to mix my gin gimlet with my grog. See if I can water that down and make it a little less. Yeah, much less tangy. Not as tasty, but whatever. Drinkable. Fresh food went bad very quickly, so you enjoyed it while you had it. After the first couple of weeks, your survival depended on dried beans, dried meats, and whatever you could scrounge up or catch. There was no refrigeration, and although the concept of canning foods had been invented in 1805, and preserving foods in quote-unquote indestructible tin cans soon followed in 1810, true large-scale commercial canning didn't start in earnest until nearly a century later. Dried beans and oats were a common staple ingredients and made up a lot of the diet of your 18th century pirate while at sea. Fish stews were an occasional treat whenever someone could manage to hook something. And it was not unknown for 18th and 19th century sailors to enjoy sea turtle from time to time. But the dietary staple you absolutely had to have was hardtack, also known as ship biscuits. The modern version of this is a thick cracker known as pilot bread. This was a legendarily tough dry disc made by baking a mixture of plain flour and water at a very low oven temperature for 8 to 10 hours. The idea was not to bake it golden brown per se, but to dehydrate it for better preservation. Packed into barrels and sealed as tightly as humanly possible, some of these ship biscuits could last up to a year, assuming it remained sealed and thus dry. However, the seals often weren't perfect, and many of the biscuits would be infested with weevils by the time you broke into a barrel of them. Then, as now, sometimes you just put up with a little bit of vermin if that's all you have to eat. So, what to do with hardtack? Well, considering the state of 19th century dentistry, virtually non-existent, especially for the working class, you'd never risk just eating hardtack as it is, because it is, as the name implies, hard, like brick hard. You'd typically get 1 or 2 of them a day as part of your rations, and you'd soak it in water, or your bowl of stew or burgoo, and we'll get to burgoo in a moment, to soften it and either make it edible up front or as a thickener for said stew. You could also grind it back into a coarse flour, mix it with some lard and molasses, and assuming the cook wasn't using the stove at the time, bake them into sort of a proto cookie called a dandy funk. I'm not doing that today because that doesn't sound good. Now, as far as food, now I mentioned the word burgoo. That word has actually survived into the modern age, but it's changed a bit. In the 18th century into the 19th century, burgoo referred to basically runny oatmeal. It was a fairly runny porridge made by just boiling oats. I'm also not going to do that because that's a little too simple. You get the idea of what oatmeal is like. And oftentimes that was your meal. Sometimes served with a little bit of like dried beef or something, but oftentimes you just got the porridge and that was it, and your beverage of choice. Ooh, still quite lemmy. Um, Also, um, was I'm calling it a stew called salmagundi. It's really salmagundi is really kind of a salad from the 16th century word salmagondi, meaning an assembly of disparate things. It forms forming an incoherent whole, so it's just kind of a mishmash essentially. Pirates, however, ate something also called salmagundi, spelled with an I or a Y, which was more of a what you got stew. Um, and it could come in a couple of forms, one as a soup or stew and one as sort of a salad. You cook this up and then you served it on a bed of greens instead of in the broth. I have chosen to go the brothy route. Obviously, I can't really. Okay, I'm gonna have to pick up the camera because I can't tilt this. Um, Give you a nice crotch shot. Here we are. This is my bowl of salmagundi, and it's made something like this. I'm going to start off by browning off some beef chuck stew meat. I've adapted the 18th century recipe just a little bit, just because I didn't have any duck legs, and so I doubled up on the chicken and things like sea turtle and whatever, some small doves. I just don't have, so we're doing what we can here. So also sautéing off some aromatics, the usual mirepoix of onion, carrot, celery, along with some unusual things like the radish there, hearts of palm, that sort of thing. Deglazing with this red wine and throwing all of that into some beef broth or beef stock, along with my uh, seasoning, um, clove, thyme, rosemary, and so the thyme, rosemary, and some black peppercorns are actually in this tea infuser that I have here. Um, that is going to allow me to fish those out because you don't want to have like the peppercorns, particularly whole peppercorns, aren't really all that good to bite into. Oh, and there's a teaspoon of cinnamon that went into this as well. And you didn't see it, but when I scooped it in there, there was actually just a quarter pound of codfish. The recipe calls for codfish cheeks. Yeah, I don't have that, but I had, some frozen cod fillets, and I cubed those up and threw them in. Um, Oh, and some chicken. So I had chicken thighs, and like I said, I doubled up on the chicken thighs. It's supposed to have 2 duck legs and 3 chicken thighs, and I just ended up taking the meat off of 6 chicken thighs. So it's going to be kind of chicken intensive, but whatever. And just set that to simmer for 2 hours. And this is how my salmagundi tastes. Now, first of all, the aroma. Um, Fish is, I'm going to say, less than 10% of the contents of this, but it's very, very present. This is not something you microwave in your break room. um, but it's redolent of a lot of other things. I need to make sure my tassel doesn't go into this. Hmm. Tasty. Very greasy. Um, since the recipe did not include any sort of clarification or anything fancy like that, what you put into it is what ends up in it, and it's so it is fairly greasy. It actually coats your lips with fat every time you take a bite. The flavor is actually quite good. Um, the fish flavor and aroma is very present. but the beef and chicken, anything else that you might have thrown in there, it definitely does come through. Uh, as does the herbage. Um, the thyme and the clove are definitely in there. Um, I don't really get the hearts of palm. Um, so that's kind of interesting. Um, and I don't really get the cinnamon either, to be honest. But again, as always, I have to account for the possibility that I just can't taste it because my taste buds were shot off in the war. Mm, not bad. Now, mind you, this does include meats that you may not have. So, more than likely, this was a meal that was enjoyed at the beginning of a voyage when you still had supplies. And on that note, some of the larger pirate ships, they also carried a small amount of livestock along with them so that they would have a supply of meat later on in the voyage. You know, they would use the dried beef, salt pork, salt cod, those sorts of things, which were available to them. They'd use that as much as possible. You might have like a dairy cow on board, and some egg laying chickens so that you would have sort of a replenishable supply of protein while you were on your voyage as well. But eventually you may up eating those as well. So those were sources of meat that you might have later on in your voyage. But generally speaking, I think this is definitely a dish that you would have at the beginning. Very tasty. So what about later in the voyage? Pirate food got to be pretty bad. Because you were restricted in the ports that you could pull into because you were wanted outlaws. So you can't go into very many of the British controlled ports and just, you know, buy more supplies. Unless later in the 19th century, particularly in the Americas, there were pirate ships, privateers who operated under letters of marque and reprisal, which were basically government issued licenses to pirate. As long as you did your piracy in certain waters and it happened to support whatever government issued those letters, then you could raid to your heart's content. But if you were restricted, if you were a real pirate, outlaw to everyone involved, sometimes your access to provisions was severely limited, and you got kind of hungry. And particularly if you got stranded somewhere. Pirate Henry Morgan and his crew early on in the, I think, 1670s, they were actually stranded and they were reduced to eating leather satchels, shredded and fried. You don't get a whole lot of nutrition out of there, but it's something to fill the belly with. Charlotte de Berry, one of the rare female pirates, her crew was shipwrecked, and in desperate straits, they turned to cannibalism, eating 2 slaves and Charlotte's husband. No comment there. So to balance this out, William Dampier, who was a pirate in the late 1600s, early 1700s, described as a pirate of exquisite mind, as well as a buccaneer. He is a dedicated naturalist, world traveler, and adventurous foodie. He in his travel journals, he mentions eating a lot of things which maybe to the more refined British mind might have seemed extreme. He visited Australia over 80 years before Captain Cook made it there and was the first to describe its flora and fauna. Um, Over 1,000 entries in the Oxford English Dictionary are attributed to Dampier, many of them having to do with food, including giving us the word barbecue, um, cashew, kumquat, soy sauce, tortilla, and breadfruit. His praise for breadfruit was so enthusiastic that it led the British to attempt to actually cultivate it in the West Indies. I think William Bligh on the HMS Bounty actually transported breadfruit seedlings from Tahiti. Um, but Dampier was observed to eat flamingo, which he described as lean but very good meat. Armadillo says it tastes much like land turtle. That's like, that's like saying that grouse tastes a lot like bald eagle. Like, how do we know? Guavas says it bakes well as a pear. Ate locusts. Said very moist. Their heads would crackle in one's teeth. I have yet to find one that's moist, so that's different. Sea lions, ostrich eggs, Galapagos tortoises, the flesh of which he compared to chicken. He just ate a lot of stuff. And so a lot of pirates, not as well documented, did that because they would run out of provisions long before they could reach another friendly port. So they would catch sea turtles. They would do as much fishing as possible, and then whatever ships they managed to waylay and raid, they would of course raid for their provisions. So whatever they were carrying, and a lot of times, they would, raid a ship from another country, so they would get cuisine from another country. So, thus my first foray into pirate food. They ate more stuff. There's more stuff on the menu for pirates than just what I've mentioned here. But this is a good first introduction to the kind of diet that they ate on board. As I mentioned, a lot of times they just ate whatever they could get their hands on. So it really could run the gamut. It just depended on where they were and who they were attacking. Again, they got a lot of provisions from the ships that they raided. But let me know if you know of any other pirate food that I should explore, and I may do another episode of this, possibly without this costume, because this is actually kind of uncomfortable. So anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, like, subscribe, comment, and share. And I'll see you next time here on Recipe Redemption. Arr.